So I'm very excited to bring to you our next panel, which is Challenges in Polling. I'm going to introduce each of our guests today and give you a little background information about them. And then we have a few questions that we're going to pose, but it's my hope that it's more of a conversation. And for those of you in the audience, please feel free to ask questions, and we'll definitely leave some time at the end for students to ask questions and also to chat with our guests. So first, I'd like to introduce Patrick Murray. He's been working in public opinion research for 3 decades. He was named the founding director of Monmouth University's Polling Institute in 2005, after more than a decade at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics and Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy. The Monmouth University Poll is one of the nation's leading independent survey research centers, consistently earning an A rating from 538. Murray frequently appears as a commentator on national and regional TV and radio. During election years, he serves as an exit poll analyst for the National Election Pool. And in his home state, he frequently appears on power lists of influential people in New Jersey politics. Our next guest is Debbie Borie-Holz. She's an associate professor of teaching at the Bloustein School for Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. She's also a senior survey scholar at the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling, where she specializes in polling issues from elections, climate change, to social and economic behaviors. Prior to joining the faculty at Rutgers, Borie spent 20 plus years in senior government roles in federal and state government. She held a presidential appointment as an agency director during the Clinton administration and served as the New Jersey Assistant Secretary of State during the Florio administration. Her scholarship and firsthand experience provides unique insights into the inner workings of parties, caucuses, legislative leadership, and policymaking, and her current research focuses on voter suppression statutes recently enacted in 20 states following the 2020 presidential election, and the intersecting role of gender and race that they play in deciding who leads, as well on policy priorities. We have folks very involved in all aspects, the practitioner and the academics coming together. Next, we have Andrew Gooch. He's a assistant professor of political science here at Rowan. He specializes in the intersection of political behavior and public policy. He has 12 peer-reviewed journal articles, most of which uses survey data to answer questions about American politics. He has taught survey methodology at Yale, was a project manager at the polling firm Penn, Schoen, and Berlin, before joining academia, and he received his Ph.D. from UCLA. And then finally, Alyssa Maurice is a research associate at William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy at Stockton. There, she manages the Stockton Polling Institute, which conducts statewide public opinion research in New Jersey, as well as other research projects in collaboration with Stockton faculty. Prior to joining Stockton in 2020, Alyssa was an election research and quality control analyst for the Associated Press, where she maintained and analyzed voting data, worked on AP VoteCast, and monitored the vote count for anomalies on election nights using statistical tools. Alyssa received her master's in political science from Columbia and a bachelor's from Monmouth. So you can see here that we have very well-heeled polling folks. So this should be a very interesting behind-the-scene look at what happens in these institutions. So we came to, when we were thinking about designing the panels for this conference, we were thinking about hot topics and issues that were of concern. And it couldn't help escape my mind that, leading up to the elections and often talking with my students in classes, they were always asking about polls. What do we think we know? How do we know it? Is it going to be wrong? Will the poll say this? It's all good, or oh no, are we worried? And so there's always this kind of feeling of, we're leading and we have knowledge through the polls. Then, also noticing some articles surrounding polling in recent times. Frustrated with polling, pollsters are too. A political article said, inside the temple of political polling, the high priests are starting to lose their faith. So what is going on with polling? So this is where I thought we would start today and ask you, what is the state of polling today? Does public opinion polling about issues still work? Does it work better for some issues than others? And why is that? Are there certain limits that we should just acknowledge? So I wonder anyone want to start? I know you have that op-ed piece I don't want to know if you want to lead with that or bring it in the end, Patrick.
Well, I think the one thing that we have to acknowledge here is that, and I know this is true every time I get a question about polling from the media or just pretty much anybody, is that they're talking about election polling, which is a very specific, different subset of all that we do in survey research, and it's not the majority. So some of the methodological problems that people ask about election polling are endemic to issues that we have to face in all survey research that we do, but others are very specific to election polling, which is taking something that survey research is, the basis of survey research is you know who your population is, and you take a sample of a known population about what their attitudes, behavior, and cognition or knowledge base is at that moment that you're taking that survey. Election polling basically violates both those principles. One is that you're asking them about something that's going to happen in the future. And two, you don't know who the population is that you're asking it of, because the population doesn't exist until Election Day, and you're taking the poll before Election Day. So you have to create a poll that does a number of things, asking them not only who they're going to vote for, but also what their behavior is in terms of whether they're going to be part of the population on Election Day that you should be surveying. Because if they're not going to vote on Election Day, they shouldn't be part of your population. So pollsters have to come up with all sorts of what are called likely voter models that take guesses at what that population will be. And the reason why polling has been more stable, I guess election polling has been more stable in the past, has been because our politics have been somewhat more stable. Yes, there have been shares of hits and misses in election polling throughout history, and we've seen them, and there have been some methodological reasons for them. If we go back to, say, 1948, there was clearly some reasons in the nascent days of public opinion polling, thinking that nothing would change in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the election, so why bother polling after early October? But here we have like more volatile within the last few days. But we also have volatility in who will and won't show up in ways that our typical likely voter models, which have worked in the past, don't work as well anymore. And so with that created volatility, all the potential errors that have always been endemic in likely voter models are being shown. It's basically, we were able to get by because the errors didn't happen, but the errors were always there for the potential. And the other problem is that the level of precision that polls are held to in terms of the public perception. And what I mean by that is, if I say that 63% of the public support legalized abortion, and the real number, if we can define the real number, is 60%, or if the real number is 66%, you would say, your poll was basically right. But let's look at another election poll where my poll says candidate A is ahead by 2 points and candidate B wins by 2 points. Well, then suddenly the poll's wrong, even though the amount of error was basically the same in those two polls. And that's part of the problem too.
And for the students in the room, I just want to tell you I understand, because my mentor now is like sitting in the front row here, my professor, who taught me most, along with Cliff Zukin, what I know about survey research. So I'm just a wee bit nervous. But the one thing he taught me is polls aren't meant to be predictive, but the media portrays them, particularly to Patrick's point, as predicting the outcome. That's not what we're doing. That is not a method that's able statistically to predict outcomes. It's a snapshot in time. We can do trend analysis with 3 or 4 points in time and look at trends and factor in the measurement of error, but we will never use a poll to predict the outcome. It's done all the time, whether it's an election day poll or a public policy poll, what's going on in the Garden State. So that's the first. I think these forums are really helpful for us as survey methodologists and pollsters to educate the public and the media. Our organization our professional academic APOR, has a great kind of tutorial, things that the media should know, understand about polling. But this is just something the public has a better understanding of measurement error, to Patrick's point, that 2 plus or minus 2 points, plus or minus 3 points within the measure of error. But at the end of the day, it's not meant to predict, so let's stop using them for that. So when we do put a snapshot out in time, and just a really good reference is the last gubernatorial, where Murphy was seen up by double digits. Well, we never had him at double digits, but Patrick was in the field about a week before us, and our numbers were different than his. And so we're like, what, did we miss something? Like, what's here? Because what's the problem? Coverage error. There's 4 kinds of survey error. We don't talk about coverage error, the error that happens before you go into the field. So who's the target population? One of the things that they'll teach you in a basic survey class, never test the hypothetical. What are we doing in polling? We're testing the hypothetical. We're violating all the rules when we do an election poll. The other thing, election polls, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, they're fundamentally, in the past, they've been dual frame, cell phone, landline. That's not the best way anymore, right? Response rates have gone down across all modes. There's mixed modes designs. They're not typically utilized in the field, where we use, sometimes we use online probability panels. We're looking at mixed mode effects. We're looking at, should we do probability and weight them to, again, some unknown population that hasn't shown up to vote. And I would say, in an audience of political scientists and somebody like myself who had to figure out win numbers for candidates, I never knew who was coming out to vote until Election Day. And, the scariest day in America for a politician is when there's higher than expected turnout, because they didn't target those voters. So it's the same thing for pollsters. But the thing that I think about us is, hey, if we think we missed something, like not waiting to education in the 2016, then we go back and we self-examine that. We learn from what do we know. It's an art and science, polling, and the science with technology and the culture, what's endogenous, unique to individuals, change. I've sat for the last year screaming at the TV. It's a bad time to be around in my house when it's election season. When they're telling me about the red wave, I'm like, how do you know it's the red wave? Why are we voting? Why are spending millions of dollars in campaigns if, I spent $4 million in the last statewide state Senate race I ran in the 90s. I'm like, why did I spend that money if I could just sit back and think that historical turnout was going to happen? When you get to Election Day as a strategist and a political scientist, if you're within 5 points, you can win that on the ground on Election Day, depending on who turns out. And to Patrick's point, we don't know who that is. We don't know what a campaign's ground game looks like. We don't know if it's going to rain and people aren't going to vote. And until recently in New Jersey, we didn't have early voting. And now we have early voting. So what does that look like in polling? So with that, I think you're going to find some agreement here, but I'll toss it to my colleagues here. I can see shaking their heads.
So my take on it is, why are polls even being questioned? Why are people like, well, all polls are wrong, et cetera, et cetera? Well, a lot of it is rooted in the 2016 election, right? So polling in the 2016 election was inaccurate, particularly at the state level. But why I think are people have such negative view of it. I mean, part of it is those polls were aggregated by things like 538, which is run by Nate Silver, and then he comes up with these probabilistic models to try to determine who's going to win or not win the election. And I can't remember the exact percentage, but his original model before he did all this tweaking after the election was like 85% chance of Hillary Clinton winning. Right, which obviously ended up being incorrect. And so I think part of it, I almost feel sympathy for voters or just regular people walking around the planet who think, well, I can't trust the polls because 85% chance is higher than 50%, so therefore therefore Hillary is going to win. So I think, part of it is understanding what these models are doing, and there's a really great study by a guy named Sean Westwood. He's a professor at Dartmouth that basically showed these types of percentages to actual voters, and when people see 60%, 40%, people interpret that as that candidate who has 60% chance of winning, that they are almost certainly going to win, right? It's interpreted like 100%, right? And so I think there's kind of these levels of understanding for these models to be useful. And in general, I'm really, really positive about polls. It's just you have to understand that they're not the gospel, and there's some problems with them. Sometimes they're systematic problems, sometimes they're random. And the first, the most base level is getting past that 60% doesn't mean 100% thing, right? They're probabilistic models. But then the second, I think the kind of the next level understanding is also looking at the flaws of those probabilistic models, okay? If you set up the world where it's probabilistic and even if, let's say Nate Silver had a model that said Hillary Clinton has a 99 shot of winning and Donald Trump has a 1% shot of winning, well, guess what? After the election, he can still come back to the public and say, what are you talking about? I'm right. I gave him a 1% shot. I'm not predicting a specific outcome. I'm giving you probabilities of different things happening, right? So that's effectively we are practitioners and academics. In the academic world, that's an unidentified model, right? That's really bad if you can't be proven right or wrong with some sort of model that you're trying to explain to the world. So even the kind of the next level understanding, I think still confuses or angers the public, right? If you then say, well, it's probabilistic and, well, I gave him a 15% shot, some people are going to be even more cynical about polls after that. So I'm actually really sympathetic as someone who, deals with polling and, academic surveys all the time. I'm very sympathetic to why somebody might be skeptical of election polls because, people aren't necessarily trained in this and you need training to really understand what's going on. So I think polls have a lot to show us, but I'm also I'm not judgmental of somebody, just a regular person who looks at a poll and says, I can't believe that because of what happened in 2016. So.
So, now that we sort of laid out the fundamental differences between pre-election polling, candidate preference polls and issue polls, which is so important because that distinction is often not made in the coverage of polling. All polls are lumped together, and many people don't really understand that they're fundamentally different, where with, as Patrick said, with one you're estimating a population that you don't yet know, and the other, the population you're trying to study. So I just want to go back to that initial question about whether issue polls still work, and focus on the issue polls now as opposed to the pre-election polls. And in short, yes, that would be my answer. Yes, they do still work. And I can cite kind of a few studies that illustrate that point. But ultimately, the non-response error that has been impacting pre-election polls, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as we talk about, the recent election cycles, that error where the people that we're reaching, their answers are meaningfully different than the people we're not reaching. It doesn't seem to be impacting issue polls to the same extent. And there's, like I said, the first study that sort of comes to mind, the most recent one, is from just in the fall, Pew Research. They took survey questions on numerous measures and they compared them to high quality benchmarks, government surveys that have high response rates, to sort of validate and see how their results stacked up. And on most questions, it came within a few points on, questions of citizenship, vaccination rates, I think home ownership. So they performed pretty well for the most part. There were some areas that weren't as closely aligned with the benchmarks. I believe it was political engagement and financial indicators. And I think that tracks. We know that we're reaching really politically engaged people typically in our polls. And with financial indicators, not only are low-income populations really tough to reach, but people are not always as forthcoming about finances. I know in our experience, anecdotally, I will say that we tend to get a higher refusal rate on questions of income compared to all the others. So, those issues being kind of tough to nail down, that tracks. But Pew also had a study after the 2020 election where they took their surveys and, they recalibrated the samples to match the election result in terms of Biden and Trump support. And then they compared that to a tilted sample with, where Biden was leading by 12, because that was the highest, lead he showed in the polls, I believe, closer to the election. And they wanted to see how the issue questions differed, asking about things like immigration, politically charged issue questions that were in those surveys. And they didn't differ really between the two samples. I think the difference was less than 1 point on average across all of those, really politically charged issue questions. So, it kind of goes to show that non-response error that was impacting the candidate preference question, it was not having that same impact on the issue questions. And then kind of the last thing I just want to mention is, or study, is, there was, I believe it was released in 2021, and I'm blanking on the authors, but I know it was a joint effort between political scientists and practitioners, and they looked at state ballot questions from 1958 all the way to 2020, and they found that there was not like a systematic, bias toward conservative or liberal bias. So it kind of goes to show that these questions about issues and about specific policies, like ballot questions, are just not as impacted by that volatility. And we found that too. I know in races where we've understated Republican support in our polls, the state ballot questions were still kind of right on target within the exact percentage point in some cases. So sort of some more evidence to suggest that point.
And I think to Alyssa's point, there is a distinction between what voters or participants will tell us, and there's interviewer effects, and again, mode will matter here, whether it's an online poll or a phone call poll or a text. So, but the key is then in terms of issues, and I'm going to pull something from the panel before us where they were talking about the Florio administration and that tax on toilet paper that really became elevated in terms of, it became an issue that was in the media, so people were paying attention to it more. And at the time we were running, I was running the Senate statewide coordinated campaign. So that's the New Jersey Senate. So, we had 27 members. And after that election, we had a pollster, Melman Lazarus, who said, you'll be lucky if you have 15. We had 13 on election day. We had a Friday scenario of a possible 21, and we had 13 by election night. And one of the things and I learned my best lessons, both practically and academically, by mistakes. Like, what did we miss here? Florio at the time, he didn't lose by that much, by the way, 17,000 votes either way. But there was, I believe, within the brain trust at the time, he had done the right thing on quality education. He led before the Supreme Court mandated something, raised $2.8 billion in income taxes, what people didn't like. More people didn't like the penny on the toilet paper. But he also took on the gun industry, took on the teachers union. So he had a lot of natural enemies that could organize. But when we polled on those issues, they were 85%, the public was behind us. What Melman says, yeah, absolutely, but nobody cares. They didn't care about assault weapons bans at the time. If you ask that question today, we'd probably get 85, 90, and people would care. So that was the first time I ever saw polling data with a regression model, so where he cross-referenced, okay, what do people think on this issue, but do they care about it? Will it motivate them to vote for a candidate? Will they translate those issues? And it didn't. So all those great 85% good policy issues we thought we had was not the focus of the electorate in that election cycle. You reran that election 6 months later, or you ran that same election today, he might win because guns matter, right? Maybe a penny on the toilet paper wouldn't matter as much as children's safety. So it's a really good point that Alyssa makes in terms of differentiating, even within a poll, what does the data mean, and what other analysis can you run to see whether you can model it, can you regress it, what does this look like, and does it matter to voters, because that's what they'll vote on.
Salience is so important, and I try to tell this, reporters are just nuts, because you can poll on anything, And it'll say, again, 60% support whatever policy it is. And they're saying, isn't there a demand for that? I said, no.
No.
Supporting something in a poll, saying, hey, you got to show, here, let me throw this at you. You may have never thought of this before. Do you support or oppose this? That sounds good. I'll support that. And then they'll report. The public demands this. 2/3 of the public demand this. It's the same thing as with election polling. Election polls predict this. They predict this. Or this. I show this slide sometimes when I give a presentation here of the 2016 election polls. Is that all these headlines that said the election polls fail to predict? Well, yes, of course they fail to predict. They were supposed to predict. But an example of the salience issue that's recent, and it's not that important, was before they built bike lanes in Manhattan. And so one poll did, do you support or oppose bike lanes in Manhattan? They got 60-some% support bike lanes in Manhattan. And then the media are saying, and I think even this pollster kind of pushed what that really meant. And then another pollster asked, do you support or oppose, do you have no opinion of bike lanes? And so you take about half of the support and it went into no opinion when you gave them the no opinion option, right? And that wasn't important to them. So that's one thing that we have to be aware of. I did want to say one thing though about election polls, because I think we have to talk, because what I'm concerned about is that the problem that we have with the perception of election polling and how in the past, if we had a miss, pollsters would be able to get the benefit of the doubt. We would take our licks and people would say things to us, and then we move on because we still had a long track record and people would abide by the track record. We no longer have that opportunity or ability to get the benefit of the doubt anymore in this very our divided political environment. Our culture is just so deeply divided that we aren't able to do that. So I think it's endemic on us to figure out what our contribution is to that conversation so that we don't undermine trust in all the other important things that we are doing and that we want people to pay attention to those issue polls. And a couple things, because Danielle, you mentioned the op-ed I wrote. I wrote an op-ed after the 2021 election saying I blew it. And the reason why I blew it in the sense that the poll was wrong, because polls can be wrong, and I'll explain why that poll was wrong because we figured it out. But I blew it in the sense that we were giving a false narrative. We're helping to feed a false narrative about where the election was, and that was what I was really upset about. Was that I made a contribution to this narrative that wasn't accurate, even though all the polls, your poll, my poll, showed Murphy losing support. It was from what level? I mean, so our range was between like 9 and 11 points that we had him, and he ended up winning by 3.5, 4 points. But I also polled the Virginia gubernatorial election, and that was fine. So my question to myself was, okay, what do we do here, and what do I need to do? So the first thing was figuring out what we did wrong. And you talked about coverage. It turned out it wasn't a coverage issue for us because we go back and we took everybody that we polled and we looked to see if they actually showed up to vote.
That's good.
Right? So we looked to see whether our likely voter model worked. And we had a range of likely voter models. This is what happened. And in fact,
And you're using registered voter.
we're using a registered voter list, so that's why we can go back and verify this. We found out two things that happened is that while turnout in Virginia's gubernatorial elections has gone up every 4 years for the past 3 or 4 cycles, in New Jersey it's gone down every 4 years in the past 3 or 4 cycles, which means that the more that turnout goes down, the more likely a small skew of 100,000 voters showing up who are in a different type than you thought that were going to show up will totally change the outlook from a 4-point race to an 8-point race, right? And in fact, you're going to have a speaker here at lunch who will verify exactly what I'm about to say. What we did when we looked at our likely voter out model and who actually showed up versus who we thought was going to show up and who we didn't think was going to show up, we had two things that happened there. The urban vote was down slightly, and number of urban voters who went out was just down, period. And that, of course, impacted Murphy in a way that we didn't think it was going to go down that much. The other thing that happened, again, likely voters, is we're trying to figure out who votes based on their past voting history as well as their interest. In this part of the state, we saw voters come out who never voted in state election cycles in the odd numbered years. These are voters who only would come out and vote in federal elections. And again, we're only talking about maybe 100,000 of those voters showed up, but that was enough to change what happened statewide, was enough to change what happened in the 3rd legislative district in particular. Because of the way they
Scariest
were.
day in America.
Yeah, it
when
was
that happens
really,
for
and
politicians.
And by the way, what happened?
I've lived that
right,
many times.
What happened there, is that, and nobody had these voters in their likely voter model because they never showed up in state elections because they were only concerned about national issues. They were concerned about the national issues of critical race theory in our schools and all that stuff, which were not really issues in the state race. But because our political environment and the way we get information has changed, that we're not looking at, like, the reason why the Republican Party in New Jersey could be more successful than the Republican Party nationally in New Jersey elections was because voters would look at those two differently. The state party and the national party were different. It's no longer like that. So what happened is that we had these conservative, working class conservative voters who were getting this message from their social media streams and whatever, that the Democrats are out to tell you what's going to be taught in your schools, and that's bad. And they said, oh, I got to come out and vote in the state election, when they never did that before. So that was really a fascinating part of what happened. But it then said, well, if the turnout's going to be so strange in every election, and we can't do, at pollsters, we can't come up with likely voter models to do that. And I tried to use a range of likely voter models, which I started in 2018 using as a way to kind of get away from a clear prediction. The question becomes, can we do any likely voter models at all? And so in the 2022 cycle, what I did to change this, and I'm going to reveal myself as a hypocrite here in a second, is what I did to change this is, instead of asking the typical horse race question, we polled Pennsylvania and Georgia, is I asked the likelihood of supporting each of the individual candidates, and then looked at the floor and ceiling of those candidates. What's their floor of support? What's their ceiling of potential support? Like, who's not at all likely to vote for this candidate? And then we looked at that range. And by the way, and then we looked at a couple of ways that we could cut that. Okay, here are those two results based on people who voted in the 2020 election. Here are those two results based on people who said that they were highly motivated to go out and vote. You pick your poison. These are just the results. This is the range, and these are the issues that are important to these voters when they're saying that they're likely to vote for these candidates or not. And just as a side note, we're doing I'm going to present this at APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, which is their conventions and national conferences in Philadelphia this year in May. We're doing a content analysis of how the press has covered the way that we did the poll, because a lot of them still had to treat what we did as a horse race, because they can't get it out of their head of not treating it as a horse race. And this is where I'm going to reveal myself as a hypocrite, is that Danielle mentioned that we have an A rating from 538.com, and it used to be A+ before the 2020 election. But the way I did these polls, I can no longer be included in their aggregate.
Oh.
I did it in a way that they can't aggregate it. So because this is the problem I had, because people don't understand the aggregation. The public doesn't understand the aggregation, so I try to get out of it. So I'm sorry, I was long-winded about it. But I think that's one of the, so I'm looking at ways where we can take some agency in trying to reformulate the way that the press has to cover polling around elections.
I just want to touch on one thing about the gubernatorial race too that you mentioned, that the polls did show, a declining lead for Murphy. So there were indicators in the polling. You just kind of have to read between the lines and not focus so much on that precise point estimate, because I know our polling showed he had pretty low approval ratings. Many people, I think it was a majority, said the state was not on the right track. So there were signs in the polling that he was going to have a tough election. So you kind of have to look at these other measures too, instead of focusing on this, very precise, having this expectation of a very precise point estimate. So
I wanted to ask I was really curious about this phenomenon of, in terms of accuracy of polling, and last question on the election polling, but asking, especially in this hyper-partisan environment, and a phenomenon that we found around conservative voters where they weren't answering questions, or perhaps we were getting biased answers, and that asking them about what their neighbor would do was giving some more clear or clarity. Did that happen? Their friends, their family, their group? What do you think your group's going to do as a way to reveal perhaps their behavior? That was so interesting to me. So can you maybe speak to that? Are you doing it? Have you seen it?
We looked at the so-called shy Trump voter, but we
Shy.
also thought there was a shy Hillary voter.
Okay.
And so we asked people, who are you supporting? Who did you tell?
Okay.
Did you tell your family? Did you tell your circle of friends? Did you tell your coworkers? And as we built out to a less intimate group, they did not share that information. Mm-hmm. So we know that, in the general, so if somebody was asked directly, if they felt they would tell us if they were wildly enthusiastic. For those who were less sure or weren't sure, they just basically said, well, I'm sure. We knew in that race you were either one camp or the other, and then there was this middle group. But people weren't willing to tell us, so we love those questions, triangulating the data. Like, what do you think your friends are doing? Same thing with drug questions. Do you take drugs? Yeah, sure, no. But I'm always amazed people tell us that. But then we ask, but how about your friend group? So what are they thinking? Because people are, that's satisfying. It's always amazing to me that people want to satisfy somebody on the phone. What we noticed, though, too, because as Patrick said, and everybody here, we test this, right? We run experiments within these. We want to know the answers to these. We want to figure out what we did right or wrong. We're using, now experiments, again, for at APOR we're presenting on, should we do an RDD general pop? Should we do registered voters? Should we wait it? When we got the Chitterelli, which was a week after Monmouth's, same polling house, so we felt like we had reliability there. We're like, wow, why is Patrick's numbers higher than ours? But that was the first time that 50% of our poll of an N of 1,000 was from texting. So, and in the texting, Chitterelli was twice as likely by mode for voters to support Chitterelli in the text mode than the phone mode, whether it was cell or landline. And we're like, what do we do with this? Like 50% have Chitterelli up, and they tended to be, never would have guessed this, conservative Republican men, and highly educated. So they were texting and telling us all the things, didn't like him, gave Murphy a grade, weren't supportive, didn't think the economy was going in the right way, as Alyssa says, the indicators. And they were overwhelmingly twice as likely to say Chitterelli. What we did when we put the polling out, and we thought about that when we released the results, was the weighting. We published a couple different, here's the unweighted, here's the likely voter, here's the registered voter, here's our final weight. We weighted down the text portion because we're like, I don't know if we can trust this. We've just started to run experiments to see if folks who respond by text and online without an interviewer will share something, to your point, with us that they don't feel comfortable. Just not as well as will they respond to a text versus a phone. We also incentivize people who respond to texting versus callers. So that whole social contract that, can you help me with this, which is one of your earlier points. We recently saw, like at our APOR conference, the polls by Fox News, the responders are different than academic polls or the NBC poll. So now, because there's this concern that they're fake polls, the worst thing in the world, I'd rather get it wrong than somebody to say we're fake. And what my colleague does well, Ashley Koenig, we have to tell voters, this is your opportunity to participate in democracy. This is science. We'll tell you when we got it right and when we got it wrong, and then we'll explore why and reveal that. But this is your opportunity to participate. We test. We all probably test. Do you trust polls, right? Do you trust the media? Because if the non-responders are biasing our results, then what do we have? How much validity do we have in that? So we have to help the public understand what is the poll, what does it say? And I think the worst thing that contribute, like an NBC poll that's done in conjunction with the networks, is that's news for them. But I believe, as now an old-time practitioner, you're telling people that this race is already decided. You're impacting turnout. If we don't release national results anymore because we're worried that the western states used to know, oh, the East Coast is baked in. We used to do that. Edison, the national poll, used to release the polls when the data, who's ahead, who's behind, when the polls closed. We closed earlier on the East Coast. They felt that that was driving down turnout on the West Coast. So they don't do that anymore, Edison Research. So why are we doing that in the media, leaving up in terms of...
I was working on a campaign in
Right?
California in 1988 when the race was called about 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah, you're like, what? Why are we
And
going out knocking on
There's still a
doors?
Senate race in California at the time, yeah.
So if I could just add, the idea of are you getting the right people? There's a lot of evidence that there's what they call a differential response bias, bipartisanship. And it tends to occur when there's bad news for the party. So if there's bad things for the Republicans are less likely to answer polls. Or if there's bad news for the Democrats are less likely to answer the polls. So to me, it's more the bias is more about response rates, getting a balance that you would actually expect on election day. Because if there's bad news about, say, Donald Trump, a lot of Trump supporters aren't saying, well, now I hate Donald Trump. They're just not answering the phone. Right, or they're not taking a poll online. So I think that kind of bias is more so than people making up answers or anything like that. And I would also say, to the idea of text messaging, doing it online. Back when I was a grad student, I actually did an experiment like that. I got an NSF grant to randomize at CBS Universal Studios an interview with an interviewer versus taking the exact same survey behind a computer, and they're sitting in this fake living room, tried to make it as realistic as possible. And so what did we find? People are much more extreme when they're behind a computer, right? They'll moderate their answers in front of an interviewer. They'll, instead of saying I'm strongly opposed to gay marriage, they'll say I'm somewhat opposed, or I'm somewhat in favor. They'll say they're very in favor. But interestingly, they're also slightly more knowledgeable. We asked a bunch of basic political knowledge questions. So you allow people to take something by themselves. They're going to look more extreme, but they're also going to look like they're a little more interested, right? If you get text messages where it's they're all extremists who care about critical race theory and things like that, it's the mode actually kind of might actually affect that result as well. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
I just want to elaborate a bit on that partisan non-response piece. So basically, what we mean by that is, for example, you could have the right proportion of, let's say, low income, or not low income, non-educated Republican white respondents in your survey. But if the non-responders with that same demographic profile systematically differ in their vote choice, then your poll is still going to suffer. So that's that partisan non-response bias. Their vote choice skews conservative right now because that's the overwhelming narrative is fake news and the polls are fake and that's coming from a certain side. So right now it skews conservative. That could change. But because their vote choice is systematically different from the people we are reaching with that demographic profile, that creates a problem for those candidate preference polls. The promising thing is that evidence is showing that their views on the issues and certain policies doesn't systematically differ from the Republicans we are able to reach. So that's promising. That's good for issue polls. But when it comes to candidate preference, that's a very hyper-partisan choice. We know it's not driven by policy often. It's driven by tribalism and identity and partisanship. So that partisan non-response has a much bigger impact on those candidate preference questions than it does on the issue questions. So hopefully that's a decent primer about what we mean by that partisan non-response problem.
And I think if you have a general population survey where you just have phone numbers and you don't know the demographics of your sample frame, the list of people you're calling and you're texting, then to do what Patrick did is a little bit more difficult. So what we're trying to do now with some of our RDD samples, random digit dial, is to append them after the fact because there's a lot in technology, there's a lot of great services out there, vendors out there who will now take that cell phone because there's everything in the world. We're better than the FBI. We can tell you about yourself because we have access to these data sets. I tell people, did you know you did this and that you get this magazine in your house? Because we're all very active on social media and our purchases are tracked and everything we're saying right now is being picked up by our phones unless you have them turned off. So there's unbelievable amounts of data out there. So what we do with some of our vendors is now we're saying, okay, here was our sample frame. We know who the responders and the non-responders are. Match it to the demographics. So the first basic test you want to rule out is, are the responders different than the non-responders, right? You have to be able to measure non-response error now. We always knew it existed, but we can calculate that. So folks like us will go back and we're like, okay, after the fact, whether it's initial poll or not, we're also looking at whether, although surveys are exempt from the Telecommunication Protection Act, which says, if you're wondering why you get phone calls and you're on the do not call list, because we're exempt doing research or surveys. Of course, any politician will want to have their surveyors, their vendors, contact you for survey. But there is a do not call flag. So we're also now looking at, are non-responders also systematically on the do not call list? Is that attrition in the sample frame? Are they again, are they selecting out? Is that introducing bias into the sample frame of who we talk to? So I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think there's a lot of great science still here, and there's ways for us to unpack this. The biggest struggle, I think everybody said here, is we're trained in this, so we know this, but it's to educate the public and to educate. The worst thing I think is when people say they don't trust polls. I don't blame individuals. I blame the media. I blame us. I think it's a tough job out there to be a participant or a respondent.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that and pose this as the last question, then open it up. So I'm picking up on using polls to educate the public. We just launched our new Masters of Public Policy program. We have our first inaugural class of students in the room, and I'm just wondering if you can maybe speak to, what issues do polls really work well for, and then how can we use that to inform and influence public policy discourse and decisions? So as they're looking at issues and trying to figure out what works best for the common good or for the most people, or however they're kind of trying to figure it out, how can we use this information?
Hey, my favorite is self-serve gasoline. I'm happy to say we're the only state in the nation where you don't have to pump your gas. And we don't pay for it, by the way. And every politician I've been there on the legislative side and the polling side, and my husband used to work for the American Petroleum Institute. Full disclosure, we went to war on this issue. Every time we're in a gas line and we're late for something, he goes, this is your fault, because I can't pump my gas. But the bottom line is, never going to happen because New Jerseyans don't want it to happen, and polls tell us that. So we're good.
Well,
I like them for that reason.
Let's be clear. Polls don't tell us because
that's true.
I've done
I
the
take
poll.
it.
I actually did this because this is a good issue
Right.
to poll on. They don't say they don't want it to happen. They say absolutely not take away full serve at every gas station. You can allow them to also do self-serve.
This is true. These are the nuances of public questions.
But do not take
right?
away if you take away self-serve, if you take away full serve, instead and replace it with self-serve, full serve with self-serve, then we got a problem.
So
but
question
if you give us
wording
both,
matters,
then that's fine.
right?
Yeah, and
Question
that
wording
was,
matters.
And so I was clear. We wanted to do that because we did. Do you support this, or in what context? Because that's the key. They don't, and in fact, and we also tested the argument that's being made by self-serve proponents that's going to lower gas, and people say you're full of crap when you with that argument. Yeah. And it won't. Yeah, we all know it won't.
Right.
Public doesn't believe it will either.
Right.
So my take is it's going to be a bit counterintuitive to what you were saying. I think actually low salient issues are actually great for issue polls, and by salience I mean something that isn't necessarily talked about, not the most important issue. And so why do I think that? Because you get a really clean read on what people believe, particularly if you can do that before it becomes a part of a campaign or a bill that's being introduced, because then you know exactly, let's say say a position is supported like 65% in a poll, and then all of a sudden it's introduced in a legislature, and all of a sudden it moves down to 50%. And so what happened? People debated the poll, people debated the issue, and then you know exactly like what moved the policy versus like if you pull on something really highly salient like immigration, for example, something that's been a major part of American discourse, major part of campaigns. You don't know what you're measuring. Somebody might hate campaigns hate immigration because of Donald Trump. They might hate it because of some random thing they saw in the news. Maybe they had a conversation with a neighbor about something. Maybe they saw like a crime on local news. Like, in other words, it's harder to tell why you get a result on more salient issues versus a low salient issue. I think you can get more of a clean read and you kind of know where people actually stand. But of course, the problem with low salient issues is, you can change people's opinion on it, right? And so, but like, there's the great examples of like polling on Medicare for all. And, it's really, really popular if you give these persuasive messages for it. But if you give persuasive messages of why it's bad, then people don't like it anymore, right? And so like, that's still kind of a low salient issue in the sense that you can kind of push people around based on political messages. And I think it just gives a cleaner read of like, well, this message works, that one doesn't, and this is where they stand in absence of some sort of information. So
When you talk about polling low salient, you're not just talking about approve, disapprove, you're talking about following that up with a whole bunch of messages around the pros and cons around that potentially move it.
Or before some event happens, or some sort of public.
Yeah, exactly. That's the case. The problem that we have with a lot of public pollsters, and myself included, because we're putting out, we have limited real estate space in our polls, so we usually are only polling a few questions and not really the in-depth questions that you would do with if you're polling on behalf of an advocacy group who wants to put this out there, wants to know what their initial reaction will be, but then what the potential reaction would be based on what the public debate might unfold to. And to give you a good example of where polling can really help in terms of moving policy, and it's a poll that I did for an advocacy group maybe 25 years ago, was that they wanted to move from advocating to policymakers to advocating to the general public. They wanted to get the general public behind them. So they had this group of messages that they used that had been really effective for them. And they made the assumption that they would be really effective for the general public as well. And just from my experience, I knew they wouldn't. But so what I suggested to them is that let's do a couple focus groups first, and let's throw it out in the mix and see what happens. And so there were a couple things that came up with the focus group that they hadn't been talking about. So I said, let's turn those into messages. So we tested them alongside then we went and did a survey. We tested them alongside their messages, and sure enough, the messages that came organically out of the focus groups were the more effective ones to use with the public. So that's one, just to give you one example of where the polling can be used to do that.
I would just say it really should be viewed more as like a democratic tool, like you were saying before, Debbie, that it aims to serve the public. So it's concerning to see when people are dismissive of all polling after some challenges with recent election cycles, because it really is. It's a tool that's aimed to serve the public, and you can't really operate under the assumption that whoever someone votes for, that those are the policies that people support, because that's the platform that people support, because that's not always the case. That's vote choice isn't always motivated by policy and by their platform. So there needs to be some way to find out what the public thinks about issues, and polling is really still the best tool we have, despite its flaws, at which we're all trying to improve and work on. So it is the best tool, and I think that needs to be communicated, and less focus on so that the public doesn't view it as just a means for election forecasting, because it's not. So that needs to be kind of less of the focus in the media and how it's talked about. So,
well, thank you very much.